TrustTalk is based in The Hague, so why an episode about a single American city? Because San Francisco is a laboratory for a question that concerns democracies everywhere, a question about trust. What happens to trust when there is no real partisan divide left? What happens in a city where 80% of voters belong to the same party, where everyone calls themselves progressive, and where the deepest political conflicts are no longer between left and right, but among people who all believe themselves to be on the same side? That is the puzzle at the heart of my guest's current research. 20 years ago, Thomas Frank asked what was the matter with Kansas, why working-class voters kept supporting a politics that worked against them. My guest today, Margaret Kohn, who goes by Peggy, asks the mirror image question. What is the matter with San Francisco? And what does it tell us about trust? Trust in representative institutions. Trust between neighbors who nominally agree. Trust in a city as a shared inheritance when the political community fractures from the inside. Peggy is a political theorist at the University of Toronto, and she also grew up in San Francisco. The book project she's working on, What's the Matter with San Francisco, is in part a return home and a study of the crisis of the American left, with patterns already visible in European cities too. Peggy, welcome to Trust Talk.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You grew up in San Francisco in a modest stucco house beneath Sutro Tower, which your parents who hadn't finished high school. Your book opens with the memory of the neighborhood kids disappearing in the late 1970s, what you later understood as white flight. Could you take us back to that moment and say something about how a personal memory became the starting point for a book about the crisis of the American left?
Sure. So white flight usually refers to the large-scale migration of white residents from racially diverse cities to more homogeneous suburbs, often motivated by fears of property values or racism. So this did happen in San Francisco, but not to the same degree as in Rust Belt states or in the South. Now, of course, I didn't know the term white flight as a kid, but I saw my neighborhood change as families with school-aged children left the city. And I was also among the first groups of kids in San Francisco to be bused. And San Francisco was the first major city outside of the South to have court-ordered busing in order to desegregate the schools. So I ended up going to a school called Sanchez Elementary in a Latino neighborhood, and I loved Sanchez. We did lots of art projects, and we learned about indigenous history. But looking back, I see this as a pivotal moment which led to the kind of sorting that has shaped the city. So what that means is that the people who stayed tended to be more progressive and more diverse.
Your working title nods to Thomas Frank, but you turn the question inward, onto the progressive side of American politics. Why did the contradictions of the left need this kind of attention now, and what made San Francisco the right place to do it?
Well, in many ways, San Francisco is an outlier. It's not a bellwether that's typical of lots of other cities. It's one of the wealthiest cities in the country. It's also one of the most diverse, one of the most left-wing, and I want to point out, because of the focus of this podcast, one of the cities that has the lowest level of trust. So nevertheless, I think it is a good place to understand left politics, and that's because there is a progressive coalition and a moderate coalition, both on the left, and this brings the ideological differences into the open. So there are lots of public debates about what it means to be progressive, and there's a really extended ecosystem of democratic clubs with different ideological orientations. That means there's a very vibrant and public discussion about what it means to be on the left. But there are also tensions that are not always acknowledged. So one example is that San Francisco has more children in private schools than almost anywhere else in the country. And this is kind of surprising for a place that believes in equity and public goods.
From your interviews, you identify 4 kinds of leftists in San Francisco. You just mentioned 2. Moderates, progressives, populists, and what you call technocratic radicals. Could you sketch who each of these people are and why these are the lines that actually divide a city where almost everyone calls themselves progressive?
So, the first thing I want to point out is that while I'm focused on the San Francisco Bay Area, there are also other cities that are similar in lots of ways. I call them left coast cities. So, this could be a place like Seattle or Portland. So, I do think it kind of applies to a larger number of metropolitan areas. So, overall, the divide is between the progressives and the moderates. The moderates, or you might call them centrists, they basically believe or agree with the philosopher John Rawls. They think that inequalities are justified if the poor are better off than they would be in a society that had a more like egalitarian income distribution, right? They tend to think that inequality is really only a problem if the people at the bottom don't have enough resources for a decent life or don't have any opportunities. So moderates, they really want a more equal city, and they think it is possible to achieve this goal. And they also think that anybody would benefit from the policies that they advocate. The moderates also tend to defer to expertise because they themselves often have professional qualifications. So basically, they don't think that there are like fundamental tensions that are going to be very difficult to resolve. The progressives, on the other hand, they have similar values, right? They also believe in equality, but they have a very different understanding of the things that prevent these goals from being realized. They see society less as a form of cooperation that benefits all, and more as a place where unjust power operates. And that's why they call for radical change. They see the interests of the wealthy as different from the poor. Okay, so far these are pretty straightforward definitions, but we also add two other categories. One is what we call local populism. It's kind of a new concept, and it highlights the way that longtime residents, as well as those who are living on the periphery of the city, feel marginalized in a city that's being remade for a cosmopolitan elite. So, for example, local populists, they objected to the closure of a highway that was turned into a park for active recreation. And you might think, who is ever against a park? But the opponents were really angry that recreation was prioritized over more practical things like commute times and the need for a road to get to work. So local populism, like all populism, is a resentment of elites. But at the national level, it's really associated with ethno-nationalism and racism. But that's not the case in these large multicultural cities. It presents differently there. And it takes the form of quality of life issues, like such as concern about crime and homelessness, and just overall the sense that the city is no longer such a welcoming place for ordinary people.
I understand that came out of pandemic school closures, but you argue it was really about something larger. Could you first set the scene for listeners? What happened, who the commissioners were, and what triggered the recall in the first place? And then I want to ask you what reaching for a recall tells us about parents' trust in representative government and about the institutions they feel they can no longer reach through normal channels.
Okay, there are two stories about the school board recall. One focuses on the pandemic. The organizers of the recall told me that they got involved because they thought it was unfair that students in the San Francisco public school system were not able to return to in-person instruction, while students in private schools and in other school districts were allowed to do so. But there's a second story that focuses on divisive cultural issues. These include the decision to turn Lowell High School, a selective elite public school, into a school open for all, the decision to rename 45 schools, and the decision to paint over a series of murals of George Washington that were displayed at a high school. And so in the end, the recall was successful, and the voters overwhelmingly decided to recall these progressive school board members. So that's not really at all in dispute. But I think that the members of the board who were recalled would describe this very differently. They would say that really what was going on was the billionaire class, the tech elites, were flexing their power, and they didn't want to be challenged by progressive, more community-oriented activists and citizens. So I think the underlying concern was the fact that The progressives saw the city as one that was being remade in the interest of the billionaire class and the tech elites.
During the pandemic, the San Francisco School Board voted to rename 44 public schools and to abolish selective admissions at Lowell, the city's most prestigious public high school. You argue these symbolic fights happened precisely because school boards control almost no money and have few real levers over inequality. The sociologist Musa El-Garbi, who I interviewed in an earlier episode of this podcast, makes a related argument. What does it do to trust between progressive officials and parents when the loudest battles are fought over symbols at a moment when families are asking for something more material?
I guess I would challenge that framing, at least in part, because I think it's important to acknowledge that redistribution is important, but recognition is important. And I think for families and children to feel included in the school system and the city, we need to have a space for both those things. So as an example, I'm Jewish. There used to be a big Christmas concert, and the opportunity to have just one Hanukkah song made Jewish students feel more included. So I think that we don't want to oppose recognition and redistribution and see that both are important for people feeling included. In terms of like the root causes, though, of the distress that you reference in your question, there I'd like to emphasize that cities that have enormous levels of economic inequality, I think almost inevitably have a higher level of distrust, because you see people who have a lot and you see people who have very little, and it's hard to really feel solidarity under those circumstances.
One of the four kinds of leftists you describe is what you call the technocratic radical, the belief that energetic elites can transform public policy without first reshaping public opinion. Your case study is Chesa Boudin, San Francisco's progressive district attorney, who was elected on a reformist platform in 2019 and recalled by voters less than 3 years later. What does Boudin's story tell us about what approach costs in terms of public trust when reform meets resistance?
The Chesa Boudin recall was very puzzling to us when we first started this research, because really he was quite successful in the sense that it's not as if crime increased during the time that he was in charge, and yet there was this very strong backlash against him that emerged very quickly after he was elected. So this was a puzzle that we wanted to try and unpack and figure out. And I think part of the concern was that while he was introducing these, I think, well-supported, evidence-based innovations to try and address some of the criminal justice issues that were festering in the city, he didn't really have time to have a track record because his term was cut short. But nevertheless, I think that what his strategy was is the attempt to do some innovative things like very quickly. And even if people were at first a little bit reticent and concerned, to hopefully have evidence of their success that would then persuade people that this was the right way to go. And that's often what we see with the legal system, right? Like Brown versus Board of Education, the desegregation of schools. It came from experts, from legal experts, and ultimately everybody agreed that this was like a necessary and a productive and successful thing to do. So that was the idea, but he didn't have enough time because of the recall. And this strategy has been more successful with the courts than in the democratic politics.
One of your sharpest arguments is that progressive politics in cities like San Francisco rests on an unlikely alliance. The social movements of the cultural left, the climate activists, the feminists, the LGBTQ campaigners, and the wealthiest corners of the American economy, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, Hollywood. And the political philosopher Nancy Fraser calls this progressive neoliberalism. Why do ordinary voters feel that contradiction long before political scientists name it?
Well, I think voters in San Francisco are aware of this difference because it's expressed openly through these democratic clubs and the very mobilized and activist communities that are constantly developing their political programs in public. So in an environment where you have the typical left-right divide, the opposition to the right wing is enough to create a sense of common identity. Whereas in a primarily left wing or democratic city, there's more opportunity to really think about what it means to be left and to debate about that in public.
We usually hear the word populism in connection with national leaders on the right, like Donald Trump in the United States or Geert Wilders here in the Netherlands. A politics that sets ordinary people against immigrants and the establishment. You describe something quite different, a populism on the urban left. It is found among long-time city residents, often working class, who feel their own neighborhoods are being remade around them and who push back to protect the streets and the communities they grew up in. What does this kind of urban left populism share with the right-wing version, and where do the two break apart?
So I'd start off by saying that it's not exactly a left populism, it's more of a centrist movement. And given that the city of San Francisco is overwhelmingly Democratic, there's a lot of centrists who might, in another place, decide to affiliate with the Republican Party, who still affiliate with the Democratic Party because that's really where the action is. That's where like the power is. That's where the key political decisions are being made. So I think it's something that's like a centrist movement that kind of has different dimensions to it. That being said, I think that some of the key components of populism that we're familiar with from other works, like works by Kathy Kramer about Wisconsin, is something like the marginality and spatial dislocation. So the heart of what we see as this local populist movement is in the Sunset District, and it's by the ocean beach. It's very far from the places you associate with San Francisco, like North Beach or downtown or even the Haight-Ashbury. And so it can take over an hour on a slow running streetcar to get to downtown, to get to work. So there is a sense of like spatial dislocation, and also a sense that there's this different set of values. These are often small single family homes, lower middle class to middle class populations who are not the most disadvantaged of the community, but they also feel like the city being remade in a way that doesn't really feel like a home anymore. And so this can be reflect not just like gentrification, but also the types of like businesses and the type of community activities that are there. So there's a sense of being marginalized.
Your book ends with a constructive proposal, an old French idea you call solidarism, if I'm pronouncing that well. The basic claim is simple but powerful. A city's prosperity, its public spaces, its institutions are a shared inheritance built up by generations, and those who have benefited most from that inheritance owe something back. In a city like San Francisco, where wealth and distrust both run extremely high, what would solidarism actually look like in practice, in a school, on a bus, in a public square?
So the French idea of solidarism was articulated in the late 19th century, and it was a time similar to our own of really heightened inequality at the fin de siècle. And so they really wanted to create opportunities for the population to encounter one another as equals. And public schools were absolutely like the core of their vision of a more equal and solidaristic society. Now, of course, we both mentioned, I think, that there is a very high percentage of children in private schools in San Francisco. It's like, I think, the highest in the country, around 28%. And so that shows that solidarism in that way is not really flourishing in San Francisco right now. There are fewer opportunities for different people to encounter each other as equals. And so I think maybe public spaces and public festivals are other possibilities where that sort of sense of commonality and shared experiences could take place. But the key part of solidarism that I want to emphasize is not just having shared experiences, but also having a shared claim on the collective values produced by the society. So this is a materialist and a redistributive approach. So the solidarists thought There was a social product that was made collectively, and a small number of people were taking it all for themselves. And they owed a debt, a quasi-contractual debt, to the people who weren't getting enough. And so this was a normative, a philosophical argument in favor of trying to build a more equal society. And so that's what we want to sort of recuperate. And from that will follow what kind of spaces, experiences, and institutions might be able to make us feel that in our social relations.
I want to close on a finding that goes right to the heart of TrustTalk's concerns. The political scientist Robert Putnam, in his 2007 work on diversity and social capital, identified San Francisco as one of the American cities with the lowest levels of social trust in the country. That is a striking result for a city that thinks of itself as the most progressive, the most diverse, the most forward-looking in America. What do you make of that finding, and what does it tell us about the relationship between progressive politics and the actual fabric of trust between citizens?
Well, I think that's a very important study to reference. But I also did a study using Robert Putnam's data, which he generously shared with me. And it was a study that looked at associationalism in Italy. So his original book, right, pointed out that it was these types of associations that allowed people to interact with each other that led to the trust that made democracy work in Italy. But what I was able to do was to look at the data about different forms of association. On the one hand, there were Catholic associations, and on the other hand, there were communist ones. And the correlation really only extends to the relationship between these more radical communist, socialist organizations. So the density of those types of associations affiliated with the Communist Party predict the flourishing of democracy in Italian regions. And so what I think that tells us is something really important about trust. Trust is a wonderful thing, but distrust is also important. So these radical movements that were not trusting existing elites, were calling them to account, were telling them that they had to do things differently, they ultimately broke these kind of clientistic relations, these hierarchical relations, and built an equality, an egalitarian society where genuine trust could be produced. So I think that is what we have to kind of do in a place like San Francisco. We have to really challenge sometimes the power structure to build together a new, more egalitarian society.
Peggy, thank you very much for your insights, especially interesting for a European like myself. We all recognize San Francisco as an attractive city where liberalism has opened doors for many people, but hearing also the downside, if I may say so, from this large city and the role it plays in trust in local institutions and politics is very interesting. And thank you for sharing your insights.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Trust Talk. Trust is easy to praise, much harder to understand. That's what these conversations are for. Hope to see you back for the next conversation.